Welcome to section 6.9. This section is going to focus on quadratic equations. We're going to solve quadratic equations in two different methods. We are going to do this with the factoring technique, and we're also going to do this with the quadratic formula. When you're dealing with quadratic equations, often you're going to be shown a binomial times a binomial. A binomial just means that your expression has two terms. Terms are separated by plus signs and minus signs. So in each of these situations, x plus 3, that would represent two terms. The x is term 1, the 3 is term 2. X minus 5 also has two terms. So if you ever notice you have an expression with two terms, you are dealing with a binomial. Often they'll ask you to multiply the binomial. And when we multiply binomials, we use the term FOIL, which stands for multiplying the first expressions in the list, the outside expressions in the list, the inside expressions in the list, and the last expressions in the list. I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. So for example, let's say I asked you to multiply 2x plus 4 times x plus 6. First, you would take the 2x times the 1x, which would give you 2x squared. You would take the 2x times the plus 6, which would give you positive 12x. You would take the positive 4 times the 1x, which would give you positive 4x. And last, the positive 4 times the positive 6, which would give you a positive 24. Once you have it FOILed, you should combine like terms if you have any like terms. So our final answer would be 2x squared plus 16x plus 24. Trinomial is similar to binomial. It just means you have three terms. So for example, x squared plus 8x plus 15 has three terms in it. It's also x squared plus 11x plus 28 also has three terms. So that would be considered a trinomial. One thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to factor trinomials. So in general, when you factor trinomials, you want them to factor to be two binomials. So for example, if we look at the expression x squared minus 6x minus 16, we should be able to get this factored down to two sets of binomials so that if we ever FOILed it, we could get back the x squared minus 6x minus 16 again. Okay, so for example, what two items could you multiply and create an x squared? Well, the only way to get an x squared is to do an x times an x, and those would be your first term. Now you have to look at the negative 16 to decide what goes in your last two spaces. So when you're doing this, I would just make a list of all of the numbers that you could multiply to create a negative 16. You could do a negative 1 times a positive 16. You could do a negative 16 times a positive 1. You could do negative 2 times 8, or negative 8 times 2. And you could do positive 4 and negative 4. Those are the only ways I can think of to multiply to get a negative 16. So which one is the correct choice? Well, the way that you decide which one is the correct choice is by looking at the middle number, the negative 6x. You need to find the combination that when you multiply it, it creates a negative 16, but when you add it, it will create a negative 6. So if we added negative 1 and positive 16, that would add to be 15. So that can't be the right combo. If we added negative 16 and positive 1, that would add to be negative 15. Still not the right combo. If we add negative 2 and 8, that would add to make 6. We need negative 6. If we add negative 8 and positive 2, we get negative 6, which is what we're looking for. So you would go over to your expression and you would write x minus 8, x plus 2. Now, some people like to check their answer to make sure that they have it right. So if you want to check your answer, you could just try to FOIL it. So if I FOILed x minus 8 times x plus 2, I would get x squared plus 2x minus 8x minus 16, which would simplify to be x squared minus 6x minus 16. So this one does check. So anytime that the leading coefficient is a 1, you can use that method. It does get a little more tricky when the leading coefficient is not 1. So in this example, we have the expression 6x squared minus 11x minus 10, and we've been asked to factor the expression. Okay, so this is a little more tricky. So you still want to get it down to two binomials, but I like to do what is called the AC method when I factor these. Okay, so I take my A term, which is my 6, times my C, which is negative 10, and I multiply those together and I get negative 60. Now I'm going to do the same process I did in the previous problem where I think of all the ways to multiply to get negative 60. And then I'm going to see which ones add up to be negative 11. So to multiply to get 60, you could do 1 and 60. One needs to be positive and one needs to be negative to produce a negative when you multiply. You could do 2 and 30. One positive, one negative. You could do 3 and 20. You could do 4 and 15. 5 and 12. And 6 and 10. Okay, now you want to find the combination that when you add the two numbers together, they would add to make negative 11. So the combination you're looking for is going to be 4 and negative 15. 4 times negative 15 makes the negative 60. 4 plus negative 15 makes a negative 11. So now what I like to do is I like to do what's called split the middle. So I'm going to take my negative 11x and I'm going to split it into a positive 4x and a negative 15x. And then I'm going to carry down my 6x squared, and I'm going to carry down my negative 10, or my minus 10. Now I haven't actually changed the problem, I've just changed the way that it looks. So it kind of looks like the step in FOIL that you have before you combine the like terms that are in the middle. So now what we do is we call factor by grouping. So take your first two terms and group them, and take your second two terms and group them. Notice that I have a plus sign between my two groups. If you look at group 1, you have a 6x squared and a plus 4x. Do those terms have anything in common? Well, those terms are both divisible by 2x. So if we were to divide each of them by 2x, we would be left with 3x plus 2. Look at your second group. You have a negative 15 and a negative 10. Do those have anything in common? Those are both divisible by negative 5. So if I were to divide each of those by negative 5, I would have a 3x plus 2. Now, is it coincidence that you got 3x plus 2 in both spots? No, it is not. So take your common 3x plus 2 and put that in the front, and put your remaining 2x minus 5 in your next set of parentheses. And you have factored the trinomial. These are a little tougher. I do have a link in the discussion area that has another example of this method if you would like to try it. Okay, so now that you know how to factor quadratic equations, we now have to learn how to solve them by factoring. Okay, so the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure that your quadratic is in standard form. When your quadratic is in standard form, you should have a 0 on one side, and you should have your x's written in decreasing order. X squared first, plain x second, no x last. Once you have it in standard form, you're going to factor the quadratic equation. And then you will take each factor and you will set each of the factors equal to 0 one at a time. That's called the zero product property, or the zero factor property. And then you will solve each of the factors to find out the x values that make it true. This is an outline of what I just said. Okay, so for example, let's say you have the equation 3x squared minus 7x minus 6. This is in standard form because it does have the powers in decreasing order, and it does have a 0 on the right-hand side. So you are in standard form. But you do need to get this expression factored. So let's do our AC method one more time. Our A value is 3, our c value is negative 6. So if I took a times c, I would get a negative 18. So I need to think of ways to multiply to get negative 18 that will add to be negative 7. Okay, so numbers that multiply to be 18 are 1 and 18, 2 and 9, and 3 and 6. You need one positive and one negative in order to multiply to get a negative 18. Now I need to pick the combo that when I add it together, it will add to make a minus 7. And so that combination is going to be positive 2 and negative 9. So I'm going to come up to my expression and I'm going to split the negative 7 into a positive 2x and a negative 9x. I'm going to carry down my 3x squared in the front, and I'm going to carry down my minus 6 at the end. Now I get to do my factor by grouping. I'm going to group my first two terms, I'm going to group my second two terms, I'm going to make sure there's a plus sign between them. I'm going to factor out their greatest common factor. Group 1 each has an x in common. I'm going to divide each of those by x, which will leave me with 3x plus 2. Group 2 each has a negative 3 in common. I'm going to divide each of those by negative 3, which will leave me with 3x plus 2. Each group has a 3x plus 2. I'm going to take the common 3x plus 2 and place that in the front, and I'm going to put the leftover x minus 3 in a second set of parentheses. So you have factored the quadratic. Now you're going to do the zero product property where you set each one of the factors equal to 0. And then you will solve each of the little equations. So if I solve 3x plus 2, I'm going to have to subtract 2. I'm going to have to divide by 3. And I have that x equals negative 2/3. Or I could add 3. And my other equation is that x equals 3. Now, can you solve this problem using your graphing calculator? You absolutely can. If you would like to do it with your graphing calculator, you would graph the quadratic equation and you would try to find the locations where the graph crosses the x-axis. I can show you an example. We'll use the same problem, 3x squared minus 7x minus. Okay, so let me show how you could do this. So our equation was 3x squared minus 7x minus 6 equals 0. So let's look at what the graph of that is going to look like. So I'm going to insert a little graph here for you so that you can see. So let me put in my 3 x squared minus 7x minus 6 equals 0. And we can graph this equation. Okay, the graph is not showing up, but if you did the graph, you would notice, I'm going to take my pen here, that you should be crossing the graph at 3 and at negative 2/3. And this graph will form a parabola, just like this. We'll cover more of the graphing in the next section, but just know that you can check your answer on your graphing calculator if you'd like to. Okay, so often people are not big fans of the factoring process. So if you're not, there's another way that you can solve, and you can solve using what's called the quadratic formula. First thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have your equation written in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Once you do that, you need to identify your a value, your b value, and your c value, and then you'll fill in the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Some people will sing a little song kind of the pop goes the weasel, x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, to help him remember it. I don't care if you sing the song or not, but it might help you remember it when you go to complete the problems. Every once in a while, you'll run into a situation where there is no real solution. You will know that right away because when you do the quadratic formula, you'll get a negative number inside of it. If that ever happens, that means there's no real solution to the problem. So let me show you how the quadratic formula works. If you have the equation 4x squared minus 8x equals negative 11, first thing you want to do is put it in standard form, which means, sorry, I said minus 11, it's minus 1. You need to put that minus 1 on the other side by adding it to both sides. So it'll now say 4x squared minus 8x plus 1 equals 0. In this problem, a is equal to 4, b is equal to negative 8, and c is equal to 1. And then you can fill in the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so when you do that, anywhere that you see a b in the problem, you will replace the b with a negative 8. Notice I'm putting it in parentheses. That's going to matter when you go to square it. Anywhere you see an a in the problem, you will replace the a with a 4. And anywhere you see a c in the problem, you will replace it with a 1. Okay, now I personally like to do the stuff that's under the square root first when I go to solve these problems. Let's scoot this up just a little bit. Okay, so I would do the negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 first. Now if you take negative 8 and you square it, you're going to get a 64. And then if you do 4 times 1, that is going to give you a 16. And 64 minus 16 would be 48. So we would have x equals, two negatives combined would be a positive 8, plus or minus the square root of 48, all over 2 times 4, which is 8. To get your two answers, you'd need to put that in your calculator. You'd first have to take 8 plus the square root of 48. That's 14.92. And then divide that by 8, which would be 1.866. And then you would have to do 8 minus the square root of 48. 8 minus the square root of 48 would be 1.07, and divide that by 8. And that would give you 0.1339. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times that's not the answer that they are looking for. They're expecting you to simplify the radical. So let me show you the other version of the answer they may be looking for. So remember earlier we said we have x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 48 all over 8. So a lot of times what they're hoping you'll do is you'll simplify the square root of 48. So when you simplify a radical 48, you're looking for the largest perfect square that can evenly divide it. So you're supposed to know that 16 is a perfect square, and that 16 can divide 48 3 times, and that the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 48 would simplify to be 4 radical 3. If you didn't know that the 16 was the perfect square, another way that you can do this is you can make your factor tree if you want to. So you could take your 48 and think of two numbers that multiply to make 48. A lot of people would come up with 6 and 8. And 6 is 2 and 3. And 8 is 2 and 4. 2 and 3 are prime numbers. 4 is 2 and 2. Okay, so 48 is the same thing as 4 2s and 1 3. So since it's a square root, you want to look for two of a kind. So I've got a pair of 2s I could bring out, I've got a pair of 2's I could bring out, and then I've got a 3 that has to stay in. So 48 could simplify to be, again, 4 square root 3. Now, once you have it simplified like that, you then need to look to see if the numerator has anything that can be factored out. If you notice 8 and 4 in your numerator are both divisible by 2 or by 4, so you should factor that common item out, which would leave you 2 plus or minus radical 3. And then you are allowed to simplify the 4 and the 8. So 4 can go into 8 2 times. So our final answer would be 2 plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. When you go to write that in my math lab, you'll have to write it as 2 separate answers. 2 plus the square root of 3 over 2, 2 minus the square root of 3 over 2, with a comma between them.